The massive sun lazily lifted its thick face over the horizon. Its first rays raced towards the shore, playfully diving into the waves from time to time. A light breeze gently stirred the branches of tropical trees, bringing with it a sense of freshness and coolness. The morning surf hissed as it washed over the white sandy beach, as if contemplating whether it was worth the effort. The turquoise, crystal-clear water revealed every stone on the seabed, making no secret of the lives of its inhabitants. A swift crab emerged from beneath a small rock and scuttled purposefully sideways. The retreating waves tried to pull it back a couple of times, but the crab stubbornly pressed on toward its goal. Reaching it, the creature circled its target for a few moments, as if deciding where to start. Finally, the scavenger made up its mind. Stretching out a claw, it tore a small piece of meat from the torn abdomen of a dark-haired woman lying with her legs in the waves, facing the rising sun. Clumsily clutching its prize, the crab scurried back toward the rocks. The sun climbed higher into the sky, casting an indifferent gaze over the scene unfolding beneath it. Hundreds of mangled bodies littered the once fashionable resort beach. Gnawed limbs, disfigured faces, and torn necks all pointed to a sudden attack by a pack of creatures with powerful claws and fangs. However, if someone with even a basic knowledge of medicine had examined the wounds, they would have realized that the bite marks belonged to the most dangerous predator, the apex of the food chain. Man. A man trudged wearily along the devastated beach, past the crumbled, still smoldering, stylized huts. He moved carefully, trying not to look at the faces of those he was stepping around. In one hand he held a pistol, dull in the sunlight, while the fingers of his other hand gripped the machete's handle so tightly that his knuckles were white. Despite being young, his hair was completely gray. Walking past the wooden stage where a popular jazz band was supposed to play the night before, he changed his course. His legs could no longer hold him up. Collapsing to the ground, he fumbled, trying to find a comfortable position, then leaned his back against a tree trunk and reached toward his waist. Finally finding what he sought, he twisted the cap off his flask with one motion and greedily gulped from it. His sharp Adam's apple bobbed under his taut skin, and his red, sleepless eyes widened slightly as the alcohol burned his throat. He drained the flask in a few swallows and tossed it aside. His tear-filled eyes rose to the sky. My God, what have we done? What does it say? Jean slapped away some creeping insect from his neck and glanced questioningly at Mark. The Canadian wasn't in a hurry to respond, brushing dirt from the letters carved into the massive stone slab with a gloved hand. Did you hear me? What does it say? Andre, the most jittery and irritable member of the group, nudged Mark's shoulder. Jean didn't like Andre, dressed in a faded camouflage outfit, constantly chewing gum. The aggressive Russian didn't sit well with him. Jean, with good reason, believed Andre was an alcoholic. Even during the team's formation, Jean had decided to keep an eye on the suspicious Russian and, if possible, never let him get behind him. Andre was short, stocky, with a small head and impressive muscles. The image of a hardened thug was completed by a massive, nickel-plated Colt python hanging at the Russian's side. And as Jean had already witnessed, Andre didn't think twice before pulling the trigger. So, what's it say, Mark? Dr. Thornton stepped closer, peering over the Canadian's shoulder. Throughout the expedition, Jean had wondered what had compelled the cultured and intelligent Thornton to join their ragtag group of adventurers. It was easier to imagine the doctor in a lecture hall, pointer in hand, patiently explaining a difficult concept to dull students, than hacking through the Mexican jungle with a machete, furiously swatting away endless insects. It says that those who dare to enter here will be cursed. Their souls will wither, but their flesh will remain alive. A few more lines of the usual curses against looters, mixed with warnings to beware, and something else in a dialect I don't understand. The typical ancient nonsense. I've seen dozens of such warnings, Mark finally said, snapping out of his concentration. The nearly 7-foot Canadian with the build of a professional athlete and 3 degrees was yet another paradox in their colorful group. It was hard to say which list was longer. The languages and dialects, dead or alive, that Mark was fluent in, or the number of countries where he was wanted for various offenses. The blonde Canadian was quite popular with women, much to the dismay of the Russian. In the beginning, Andrei had constantly provoked the Canadian, asking him if he knew how to play hockey or how much rye whiskey he drank daily. At first everyone found it amusing, but soon it grew tiresome, and eventually it started to annoy. The unflappable Canadian just smirked in response to Andrei's taunts, and bulldozed his way through the jungle, like a rhinoceros. This continued until the crude Slav began mocking Canadian sovereignty, claiming the country wasn't truly independent but under the influence of other nations. A few calculated punches to the stomach and liver, coupled with a detailed explanation of what would happen to Andrei's drunken Slavic face if he didn't shut up, worked wonders. Andrei backed off, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey, what's going on down there?" A broad face appeared over the edge of the pit. No one really knew what role the Irishman played in the group, but he was always around, tirelessly helping everyone, lifting spirits with good-natured jokes, carrying double or triple the load, and never shirking any task. Soon it became clear that without him, things would have been much more difficult. No one knew where he was really from or even his real name, but everyone called him the Irishman. "We found the entrance," Dr. Thornton said, looking up. "Go get Miss Mary, and let's crack this open." The Irishman smiled widely, gave a thumbs up, and disappeared. "Suck up!" The Russian spat on the ground. Thornton merely glanced at him disapprovingly and shook his head. Then his gaze returned to the stone slab. Their objective lay beyond it, and soon their future wealth would depend on whether they had correctly interpreted the old manuscripts. With a grinding sound, the stone slab shifted aside. Jean exhaled and turned to the others. "That was a bit more difficult than a bank vault," the Frenchman croaked. The Irishman chuckled. Mark grinned broadly, and Andrei only scowled. "I still don't get why we're dragging this Frenchman along. We should have just blown the door open. No alarms will go off and no cops will show up. Now we have to share the treasure too." "Andrei, shut up. If you had a single brain cell, you wouldn't be saying that." A soft, melodious, and slightly mocking voice cut in, hitting the thug like a whip. He shrank back and tried to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. Meanwhile, the voice continued. "The ancient Maya were very clever. If you'd just blown the door open at best, we'd find nothing inside because the cave would have collapsed. At worst, we'd fall into some kind of trap, or worse. But thanks to Monsieur Jean, we can enter and leave safely, taking what we need." "Thank you, Jean." The owner of the voice finally stepped into the clearing in front of the cave entrance. Miss Mary was a petite blonde, but even at just over 5 feet tall, she had an undeniably stunning presence. Of all the expedition members, only Dr. Thornton wasn't openly drooling over her. Her tall, firm chest and long, tanned legs were impossible to ignore. Behind the large, mirrored sunglasses that covered half her face were blue eyes that seemed deep enough to drown in. Miss Mary represented the client and served as their employer. At the hotel when they first met, the Russian had tried to make a pass at her, convinced of his irresistible charm. But the barrel of a gun pressed to his skull and the sharp pain in his hand when he tried to stroke her hair quickly taught him that Miss Mary wasn't rushing into the arms of any Slavic suitor. Since then, no one had made any further attempts. "All right, guys, stop standing around!" Her voice snapped them out of the light daze caused by her striking appearance. "Let's grab this thing and get out of here. I'm dreaming of a cold shower." The expedition members began to stir. Andre, who had been assigned the role of the group's security, shrugged the short Belgian automatic rifle off his shoulder, clicked on the tactical flashlight, and started to enter the cave. But Jean, grabbing him by the shoulder, stopped him. "What the hell? Let go of me." The thug's gaze oozed contempt and anger. "In a hurry to die? Didn't you hear what Miss Mary said? The cunning Maya might have left a little surprise for anyone who followed the rules. Hold on." The Frenchman stepped forward, rummaged through his backpack, pulled out a compact gas analyzer, and a couple of chemical lights. Skillfully snapping the tubes, he shook them and waited a few seconds before tossing them into the dark cave. Then he clicked something, and a telescopic rod slid out of the gas analyzer. "Are you always this cautious?" The Russian's eyes narrowed in disdain, clearly showing his opinion of such precautions. "No, only when the lives of others depend on me," Jean replied calmly. Stepping up to the entrance, he inserted the device inside. A few more clicks, and the carbon fiber rod extended to its full length. In the dim cave, illuminated by the ghostly green light of the chemical sticks, the small indicator on the device blinked menacingly red for a moment before switching to a calm green. The device beeped shortly, and Jean began to fold the rod. "All clear," he said curtly, grabbed his staff leaning against a rock and stepped forward. "What? Are you kidding me?" Andre nearly choked with rage, but catching Miss Mary's warning look, he swallowed the words that were about to burst out and stomped off, sulking. Climbing out of the small ravine where the cave was located, he knelt on one knee and began scanning the surroundings. Jean, tapping ahead of himself with his staff, moved forward. He had barely gone a few yards when the walls of the narrow corridor abruptly opened up, revealing a large hall with a high ceiling. Jean froze for a moment, then turned toward the entrance and shouted, "It's clear." The beams from several powerful flashlights cut through the darkness, and the greenish glow from the chemical lights instantly dimmed. The rest of the expedition entered the hall. Beams danced across the room, illuminating the walls and ceiling, accompanied by surprised exclamations. Jean unclipped his own flashlight from his belt and pressed the power button. A powerful cone of light illuminated the opposite wall, and the Frenchman recoiled in shock. The entire wall was a massive carving, undoubtedly depicting some kind of battle scene. But God, how realistic and repulsive it was. The carving portrayed a massacre, clearly seen by its sculptor in a nightmare. Hordes of creatures were storming an elevated structure, a pyramid, on which stood an exaggeratedly tall and muscular man fending them off with a spear. Beneath the pyramid lay a mountain of defeated figures, yet more and more of them clambered up the steps. They resembled people, perhaps they even were people, but the sculptor's skill conveyed that there was nothing human left in them. Their gaping mouths snarled in hunger, their eyes wild, their hands reaching for the man. The scene appeared almost alive. A sudden flash blinded Jean for a moment, He jerked to the side, pressing himself against the wall, trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. When after a few seconds he could see again, he cursed loudly, ignoring the presence of a lady. Dr. Thornton brought the viewfinder of his large professional camera to his eyes again and took a few more shots. The flash blinded Jean again, but this time he managed to close his eyes in time. "Damn it, could you at least give us a warning?" Jean protested, but Thornton wasn't listening. "My God, what a masterpiece! It's such a pity we can't take it with us." "I'd love to see you try to haul an entire wall out of here," the Russian rumbled sarcastically. He took a few steps forward and crouched in front of an altar that Jean had previously overlooked. "Here lies Yaotl, the great warrior, the guardian of the path of the dead. Let none disturb him, lest the dead walk among the living," the Russian muttered mockingly. "How many of these warning plaques have I seen by now?" Mark straightened with a smile and shone his light on the altar. Besides a dried skull, there was nothing else on it. "They say that desecrating Tamerlane's grave started World War II, the Irishman mused. "Oh, come on. Miss Mary, is this what we were looking for?" "Yes, it seems to be," she replied thoughtfully. "Well then, let me have the honor of presenting it to you." And before the blonde could respond, Mark reached out his gloved hands and lifted the skull from the altar. At that exact moment, a dry click echoed, the floor trembled, and the Russian's figure was engulfed in black smoke. "What happened?" Several voices cried out at once. The flashlights flickered and went out. From the darkness came the sound of a terrifying cough. The cave shook again, small stones falling from the ceiling. Someone screamed in fear. A moment later, the trembling stopped, and the flashlights flickered back on. Jean aimed his light at Mark. The Canadian was sitting on the floor, leaning against the altar, coughing violently. "I'm about to cough up my lungs," the Canadian rasped between bouts of coughing. The Irishman and Dr. Thornton rushed to him. The Irishman managed to catch the skull that Mark had almost dropped, while Thornton anxiously tried to shine his light into the man's eyes. The coughing archaeologist swatted him away. "Mark, who told you to do that?" Miss Mary's eyes were throwing daggers. She took the skull from the Irishman and gently wrapped it in white cloth. "Why did you touch it?" "I just wanted to do something nice for you." Still coughing, Mark patted his waist, looking for something. "Did you succeed? Did you enjoy it?" Mark ignored her sarcastic tone. He snatched a canteen from the ever-present Irishman and began drinking greedily. Water dripped down his chin, soaking into the dusty ground. My God, why does no one in this group understand the concept of discipline? The woman rolled her eyes. "All right, if you don't drop dead from some ancient poison in the next few minutes, try not to slow us down. We need to be in Belize by nightfall." After stuffing the skull into her backpack, Miss Mary slung it over her shoulder and, swaying her hips, headed toward the cave's exit. Jean took a deep drag from his cigarette and exhaled with pleasure. He adjusted his umbrella to fully shield the deck chair from the scorching Yucatan sun and reached for his frosty glass. "Aristocratic habits?" A voice with a thick Russian accent barked in his ear. "What the hell do you want from me? Are you stalking me?" While he should have been irritated, today nothing could spoil his good mood. "I've heard some things about you, Frenchman. People say you like to cheat your employers. So I decided to keep an eye on you. Make sure you don't disappear with the goods. I'm quite keen on getting my money." John flinched. This brute wasn't as stupid as he looked if he'd managed to sniff out the business with Shapiro. I always honor my agreements, Russian, as long as they're honored on the other side. If you really know what you're talking about, you should know that they tried to screw me over. I just played my hand in response, Jean replied icily. Yeah, word is old Shapiro is going to rat you out to the cops. But he's got a good reputation. I doubt he would have done it out of the blue. Old Shapiro's a lame liar who just wanted to pocket all the money. He should be grateful I didn't pay him a visit afterward, Jean hissed. The Russian leaned in close, his square head hovering near Jean's ear, and whispered almost tenderly, I don't give a damn about what happened between you two. I just want you to know I'm watching you. And the first sign of a nervous twitch, I'll break both your legs. Maybe your arms too. All I want is to get my money. And you little scumbag, are not going to cheat me. Go sleep it off, you idiot, Jean said, trying not to show it, but he was getting nervous. When an oversized gorilla with a hint of intellect and unpredictable logic threatens you, it's hard not to feel tense. I want my money just as much as you do. I've warned you. Andre straightened up, spat at Jean's feet, and walked off toward the bar. Jean wiped the sweat from his forehead. Just what I needed. He knocked back the now warm martini in one gulp. His mood was officially ruined. The return trip from the cave to the bay, where their seaplane awaited them, bobbing gently on the waves with its hired pilot, felt much shorter. It was probably because they didn't have to hack their way through the jungle, following the already cleared path. The cave's location and the negligence of the border guards, or rather their near-total absence, allowed them to complete the trip in just 2 days. Jean had no idea why the clients were paying the team such a large sum of money. The risk was minimal, the time short, and the prize just an unremarkable skull. It might have had some historical value, but from Jean's perspective, not that much. The cave was right on the Belizean border, and Belize was where the rendezvous point was located. A luxurious hotel isolated from the outside world was a favorite vacation spot for the world's golden youth and aging perverts. It wasn't easy to get in. Had Jean tried to come here on his own, he would have been turned back long before reaching the driveway. But Miss Mary, or her patrons, had easily secured invitations for the entire team. The very fact that she had contacted Jean, who, while not a living legend in the criminal underworld, was still a high-level player, said a lot. The Canadian, as Jean had come to understand, was also not an ordinary man. After straining his memory and chatting with Mark, Jean became almost certain that the smiling giant and the legendary mongoose, an elite tomb raider rumored to procure new additions for private collections, were the same person. The mongoose's level was far above Jean's. Mark's occasional fits of coughing slowed them down a bit, but overall they kept to their schedule. No one could hide their relief when the forest suddenly parted, and they found themselves at the shore of the lagoon where their plane awaited. The plane, by the way, was another indication of the power and influence of their employers. No one had said a word when the sizable aircraft, engines roaring, had taxied up to the hotel dock. After unloading the team, the pilot had moored the plane with the help of the hotel staff and gone off to rest, awaiting payment. Once again, someone's shadow loomed over him, pulling him out of his thoughts. Why did everyone need something from him? He reluctantly lifted the brim of his hat, which had been pulled down over his eyes, and cursed under his breath. Standing before him was the old man, the same one. Jean had first seen him here, by the pool, lazily sprawled on a lounge chair waiting for the team to gather. The old man had appeared as if out of nowhere, standing there, staring at him. Jean had wondered how a beggar had even gotten onto the hotel grounds. Dressed in rags, his face like it was carved from wood and deeply etched with wrinkles, He resembled one of the unfortunate souls who lived under bridges back in Jean's homeland. Unable to bear the old man's unblinking gaze any longer, Jean had snapped, rather rudely, "What do you want?" The old man had continued to stare. I asked, "What do you want?" Jean added a menacing tone to his voice. Finally, the old man parted his thin, tightly pursed lips and said, "Do not disturb the shadow of Yaotl." What? Jean thought the man must also be mad. Do not disturb the warrior's shadow. Do not let evil into this world. Too much effort will be required to drive it back. What are you rambling about, old man? Jean muttered. Madmen, after all, were like children. No point in getting angry at them. Jean rummaged in his pockets, pulled out a local bill, and offered it to the old man. Here, old man, get yourself a drink. The old man suddenly lunged forward and gripped Jean's arm tightly. Do not awaken the evil. Do not remove the guardian from its path. Damn it, old man. Have you completely lost your mind? Let go of me, Jean snapped, his patience wearing thin. This had crossed the line. The old man recoiled, as if losing interest in Jean. Something in his face seemed to die. You're choosing your own fate. I warned you. Letting go of Jean's arm, the old man turned and walked away. Utter nonsense, Jean muttered, shaking his head. And now the old man stood before him again. You didn't listen to me. You're madmen. Greed has consumed you and blinded your eyes. Now what happens will be on your conscience. Damn it. What are you talking about, old man? Have you been following me? I warned you, the old man croaked once again. About what? What did you warn me about? At that moment, the sound of shattering glass and something that resembled gunshots echoed. Shards rained down from above, and the old man wheezed, pointing a gnarled finger toward the hotel. About this. Jean jumped to his feet and listened. The cool evening air was filled with the chirping of cicadas, and the wind carried the sounds of an approaching beach party. The season was ending, and the hotel owners were throwing a grand celebration on the beach, even bringing in some impossibly trendy jazz band from Europe. But other than that, he heard nothing unusual. He tilted his head back, trying to figure out where the glass had shattered from. It wasn't hard. One of the fourth-floor windows had jagged shards of glass sticking out. Jean blinked and shook his head, then looked up again. No doubt about it. It was the Russian's room. Mongoose, Jean whispered and hurried upstairs. A crowd had already gathered near the Russian's room. Jean elbowed his way through the onlookers and into the room. The first thing he saw was a wall, practically covered in blood. Directly below the window lay a nearly decapitated body. There was no mistaking it. It was Mark. Standing beside him was Andre, still holding a smoking revolver. What happened here? Jean demanded. He attacked me. Andre was indignant. What do you mean? He attacked you? The icy voice from the doorway made the Russian shudder. Miss Mary stood in the entrance. I was in my room when I heard a scream from in here. You know, one of those pretty little birds around here willing to do anything to please you. I figured the Canadian was having some fun after the long trip. Then the screams got louder. Then one of them just shrieked, "Help!" So I barged in. The door was locked, so I had to break it down. I come in, and there are two women. One runs out as soon as I enter, but the other one's beneath him. And then he looks up. The seasoned thug shuddered. His eyes, crazy, black as pitch, and his mouth, there was a piece of meat between his teeth. The woman was twitching, covered in blood, and then he jumped at me. No, I'm serious. He made it from the bed to me in a single leap. Good thing I already had my gun out. His face, twisted, and his eyes, all black. The pupils, the irises, everything, his mouth. It wasn't a mouth, it was a snarl. He came at me, so I shot him right in his maw. What else could I do? The Russian looked genuinely shaken. So did he kill the girl completely? Did she die? Completely, replied the doctor from the bedside. She bled out. Was he insane? Not until today, Jean muttered darkly and left the room. He descended the stairs and headed straight to the bar by the pool. Climbing onto a high stool, he gestured to the bartender, signaling for whiskey. Downing the drink in one gulp, he pressed the cold glass to the back of his neck. The image he had just seen didn't make sense. Mark, the most stable and cheerful of them all, had mauled a woman to death. It was simply impossible. Someone sat down next to him. Jean glanced to the side. The Irishman. Miss Mary is on the phone, trying to handle the situation. The hotel owners are used to this kind of thing, so I think it'll all work out. The Canadian and the girl have been taken to the freezer in the kitchen, though I think that's unnecessary. Most likely, once the initial shock wears off, they'll just bury the bodies somewhere on the property. There's no one to send them back to anyway. So, no complications, no police. They're still looking for the second girl. You know, the one who ran when our unhinged friend broke in. Apparently she's unharmed, but terrified and hiding somewhere. Oh, and Miss Mary asked me to tell you that the Russian share will be divided among everyone. Jean waved him off. He didn't care about the money. What do you think happened? Mark was perfectly normal, Jean said, unsure why he felt so unsettled. It wasn't as if people hadn't died in front of him before, yet something about this situation didn't sit right. I don't know, the Irishman shrugged. Maybe he ate something or took something. You never know with all the interesting substances around. The man rolled his eyes dreamily. Right. Jean suddenly felt sick. Has the confirmation come in yet? I think if it had, we would have heard by now, the Irishman said with a grin. We'll just have to wait. We'll wait, Jean nodded. If you need me, I'll be in my room. He slid off the stool and hunched over as he walked toward the hotel entrance. Once in his room, he sprawled on the bed, fully clothed, but after a moment, as if remembering something, he got up. He walked over to his duffel bag in the corner and pulled something out of the side pocket wrapped in paper. The crinkling paper revealed his trusty Glock, a 20-round automatic pistol. Andrei's gun might look cool, but by the time the Russian reloaded his antique, Jean could pump him full of lead. It wasn't so much that Andrei's threats had gotten to him. It was more of a gut feeling, a sense of unease. He placed the Glock on the nightstand, not bothering to cover it up, and, for some strange reason, slipped the spare magazine into his pants pocket. He wasn't sure why, but it made him feel calmer. He checked the lock on the door, clicked the deadbolt into place, and lay down. Sleep came instantly the moment his head hit the pillow. But when he woke, chaos had erupted around him. The head chef of the hotel's renowned Poseidon restaurant, famous for its seafood, strutted down the service corridor, proudly carrying his bulky frame. A gleaming white apron, a tall chef's hat, and perfectly curled mustache. Chef Mario looked every bit the stereotypical head chef. Whistling a simple tune, his broad smile never left his face as he marched, taking up almost the entire width of the corridor. Mario was a good boss. His staff liked and respected him. He never yelled unnecessarily, never made anyone do pointless tasks, and didn't mind getting his hands dirty when they were short on staff. Right now, instead of sending someone else to the freezer, Mario decided to go himself. Why disrupt a well-oiled machine? A big party was coming up tonight to close out the season, and there was a lot of work ahead, so he figured his team could prepare without any interruptions. Still whistling, he approached the freezer room and inserted the key card into the electronic lock. The lock beeped, the light turned green, and with a distinct click, the door opened. The light in the freezer switched on at the same time, and instantly there was a sound from inside. It was as if someone had tiptoed across the room, trying not to make any noise. Frowning, Mario pushed the door open and, carefully avoiding the frost-covered tiles, stepped forward, scanning the room. If one of the staff was playing a prank, he'd tear their head off. The temperature in here was low enough to freeze someone to death. If anyone had been locked in here for fun, he stopped dead in his tracks. What the hell? There was some kind of bloody carcass lying against the far wall. Mario backed away, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he remembered. The bodies of the Russian pervert and the girl he'd killed had been brought here. Of course. He'd given the order to place them in the first, now empty, freezer. But shouldn't there be two bodies? A soft, rustling noise came from behind him, and Mario spun around. For a moment he tried to make out who was standing in front of him, and when he did, he screamed. The creature that crept up behind him had a torn throat, and its exposed chest with sharp protruding nipples was drenched in blood. It stood, if you could even call it that, hunched on bent knees, its body leaning toward Mario, neck extended as if sniffing the air. But the most terrifying thing was its eyes. Completely black. No whites, no pupils, no irises. Their gaze seemed to pierce straight through him. And there was nothing human in that stare. The chef's scream choked off as the creature knocked him to the ground, pinning him on his back with its claws gripping his throat. Mario, a large and strong man, tried to fight back, but the once fragile girl now possessed a terrifying, inhuman strength. Sinking her sharp teeth into his neck, she tore deeper with each bite, like a Staffordshire terrier ripping into its prey, taking larger and larger chunks out of the poor Italian's throat. When her teeth found the jugular, a burst of blood sprayed from the chef's neck, drenching everything around them. Mario's body convulsed in violent spasms, while the creature sitting atop him growled in satisfaction, burying her teeth even deeper into his flesh. A few moments later, it was all over. The woman tore savagely at the chef of the Poseidon restaurant, Mario Venceroni, with a manic frenzy. Suddenly, she stopped, twisting her neck at an unnatural angle to glance around. Another creature, male this time, stood in the doorway of the second freezer, wearing the tattered remains of a hotel staff uniform. Behind him loomed another figure. The people sent to store the bodies in the restaurant's freezer had no idea that soon they would be the next meal. For a moment, the former escort stared at them. Then she moved aside, willing to share the feast with the newly turned creatures. They didn't need a second invitation. Growling and jostling, the three horrific figures tore into the body of Mario Venceroni, the chef of Poseidon. The salon black velvet was always dimly lit. Soft music flowed from invisible speakers, the flicker of artificial candles, and the dark tones of the interior created an intimate atmosphere, one adored by the patrons of this upscale brothel. Here, hotel guests were offered the opportunity to indulge any fantasy. The girls here earned quite well, even by European standards. But their work was a little different from their colleagues in the same industry elsewhere in Europe. Michelle stood in the bathroom, trying to pull herself together. It wasn't going well. Tears streamed down her face, smudging the makeup she'd hastily applied with trembling hands. Michelle had seen a lot while working at the Black Velvet, but this was the first time someone had tried to kill her. That brute must have completely lost his mind. How else could you explain the viciousness with which he ripped Laura's throat apart? She barely managed to escape. Michelle glanced at the velvet bandage hiding the long gash on her arm. God, how lucky she was that the Russian with the revolver had burst into the room. "How long are you going to keep me waiting?" The commanding, irritated voice from the room made her flinch. When she had fled into the salon, bloody and terrified, Ma Hampshire, the Black Velvet's administrator, had covered for her. The hotel management had wanted to question her, but Ma had taken pity on the poor girl and decided to give her some time to calm down. After all, Michelle's regular client had arrived. Rumor had it that he'd rented a room for the entire season just because of the night he'd spent with her last year, which meant big money. So, Ma figured, nothing bad would come from letting the girl work first, and they could talk to her later. "Baby, you're making me angry." The voice was sharper now. "I'm coming, my lord," Michelle replied, her voice trembling as she adjusted the velvet bandage and began brushing her hair. Her client insisted on being called my lord. Suddenly she shivered. Something was pounding in her ears, a dull, echoing thud, and she began to tremble as if she had a fever. She felt as though her temperature had spiked out of nowhere. She chalked it up to stress. But whatever was happening to her now unnerved her. But work had to be done. When she stepped out from behind the curtain, no one would have guessed that anything was wrong. "You called for me?" "I did. What took you so long?" "Forgive me. Allow me to make up for my tardiness." As she reached the man, Michelle suddenly gasped and, contorting unnaturally, collapsed onto the floor. Her body convulsed for several seconds before going still. She wasn't breathing. "Hey, what the hell?" The man now looked concerned. He leaned over her, trying to turn her onto her back, and recoiled in horror. It was as if the abyss itself stared back at him through her completely black eyes. Her distorted features gave her a demonic, otherworldly look. And then, in a blur, the thing that had been a beautiful girl just minutes ago lunged at him, claws tearing into his face. The walls of the Black Velvet, known for their excellent soundproofing, swallowed up his frantic dying screams. The night of terror had begun. "Get up. Get up now. It's time to try to fix what's been done." Someone was shaking him by the arm, and Jean, still half asleep, couldn't immediately understand what was happening. When it finally registered that there was someone else in the locked room with him, a cold sweat broke out. Reaching for his gun was pointless now, so he simply opened his eyes and froze. The same ragged old man stood over him. "Damn it! What are you doing here?" Jean snapped. "No time for questions. Listen." The old man's tone was so commanding that Jean stopped dead, listening. Something was happening in the hotel. Wild screams echoed from all directions, and it clearly wasn't the noise of a party getting out of hand. These were the screams of people terrified out of their minds. "What is that?" Jean whispered. "These are the shadows of the dead you've unleashed, come to claim their bloody harvest." "Can you speak in a way that makes sense?" You disturbed the shadow of Yaotl, opening a path to the ancient demons, the shadows of the dead. Now they are trying to reclaim dominion over this land. All right. I get it. You're no help. I'll go see for myself. He got up, threw on his shirt, and tucked his gun into the waistband of his pants. After checking for a spare magazine, he stepped toward the door when something slammed into it with a loud crash. Jean, it's me. Open up. Jean flinched. It was Dr. Thornton's voice. Normally, the doctor was calm and collected, but he would only scream like this if his life were in mortal danger. Pulling out his gun, Jean flipped off the safety, stood to the side of the door, and swung it open. Thornton practically fell into the room. The old professor was deathly pale, his pupils wide and darting around as if unable to focus. "Shut the door!" Thornton rasped, just as something slammed into it again. The doorknob slipped from Jean's sweaty hand, and he saw what had so terrified the professor. Miss Mary stood behind the door, her face twisted with rage, her once perfect hair now a tangled mess. Her mouth was bloody and snarling, her eyes completely black. "Shoot her, Jean!" the professor squealed, sounding far less dignified than usual. But Jean froze. He stood there, watching as the thing that was no longer the prim and proper blonde prepared to leap at him. A leap that would end for Jean in only one way, his death. Something tugged at his shirt and Jean fell backward. He landed hard on his shoulder and his gun slipped from his hand, skittering under the bed. The girl, now transformed into a beast, soared over him in a cat-like pounce, landing gracefully on all fours atop the bedside table. With a flick of her body, she twisted around to face Jean again. A guttural hiss escaped her throat and Jean swallowed hard. She was going to jump again. And she did. Once more, something yanked him by the shirt, pulling him out of the room. The deafening blast of a shotgun echoed above him, momentarily deafening Jean. The tiny blonde, struck mid-air by a round of buckshot, was torn in half and slammed against the wall. Her remains left a bloody streak as they slid to the floor and started to move. Jean swallowed hard. This couldn't be happening. A point-blank shot had nearly blown Miss Mary's chest apart. Fragments of her spine were visible through the gaping hole. But she was still crawling toward him. The disheveled Irishman standing over Jean cocked the shotgun, chambering another round, took 2 quick steps forward, and pressing the barrel to the wheezing blonde's head, pulled the trigger. In the small room, the blast was like a bomb going off. Jean's ears rang in pain as Miss Mary's head exploded like a ripe watermelon. Bits of her skull and brain splattered everywhere. The Irishman, having turned his head aside before firing, now rushed over to Jean. "You okay? She didn't get you?" "No." "But she sure as hell tried," Jean croaked. "I got scratched," came a voice from the corner. The Irishman instantly spun around, shotgun raised, chambering around. "Get up, now! Move to the wall! Look me in the eyes!" Hey, take it easy, man." "That's the doctor." Jean stood up and tried to position himself between the Irishman and the terrified Thornton. "For now, he's still a doctor," the Irishman muttered grimly. "But not for long. Can someone explain to me what the hell is going on? And where did that old man go?" Jean finally found the crumpled cigarette pack in his pocket, fished out a cigarette, and stuck it in his mouth. He rummaged in his other pocket for a lighter. Lighting the cigarette, he exhaled a cloud of smoke and sat down on the bed. The doctor stood in the corner, clutching his torn shoulder, wincing in pain. "Hell," the Irishman replied curtly, not lowering his shotgun and keeping his eyes fixed on Thornton. Irishman, wait a minute. I've still got some time before I transform, don't I?" the professor said weakly. "Transform? What the hell are you talking about?" Jean jumped up from the bed again and took a step toward Thornton, but the Irishman shoved him roughly back onto the bed. "What the hell is going on here, for Christ's sake?" the Frenchman snapped. "Let me try to explain," Thornton said quietly. "At least as far as I understand it." "Go ahead," Jean said, his eyes narrowing as he looked between the two men. He had never seen the Irishman this serious. "Well, when all that happened with Mark, I, like everyone else, felt pretty shaken up. I headed to the bar, but I realized I didn't want to drink, so I went back to my room. I'd brought a lot of manuscripts with me about this region, and while working on deciphering the map that Miss Mary gave us, I accessed some closed scientific libraries. Don't ask me how I got access to them. Anyway, back in my room, while going through the downloaded documents, I stumbled upon something interesting. You see, I couldn't stop thinking about that wall we saw in the crypt. So, I started digging into that. The thing is, the Aztecs rarely used fantasy in their art. Most murals or carvings depicted actual events. It turns out that this one was no exception. In their attempts to convert the pagan Aztec people to Christianity, the conquistadors didn't hold back. In their noble mission, they nearly exterminated the entire native population of the Yucatan. Some of the Maya accepted the conqueror's faith to save their lives, but others fought to the last drop of blood. According to legend, several Aztec tribes retreated to the mountains, taking control of narrow mountain passes, successfully fending off attacks from mercenaries from all over the world, proudly calling themselves conquistadors. But even in the mountains, the odds were not in their favor. Day by day, the defenders' numbers dwindled. And then, at a council of elders, they made the decision to bury themselves along with their enemies. The legend tells that the most powerful priests performed a forbidden ritual, summoning the god of death, Mictlantecutli. On the altar of a mountain pyramid, they sacrificed all the women and children, and the god responded. He sent his emissary, an ancient demon, the lord of the dead flesh. That night was the last for the conquistadors, who had been trapped in the narrow mountain passes by strategically triggered landslides, and for the last remnants of the Maya tribe. The few who survived the night spoke of it with horror. The dead had risen to defend the land of the Aztecs, but in doing so they spared no one. Their victims joined the terrible army, and by dawn, only a handful of survivors remained. It was only then that they realized what they had done. The hordes of dead, supposedly summoned to protect the ancient lands, had a different purpose altogether. A dying priest revealed to the remaining indigenous people and a few conquistadors, who had joined the fight against the undead, the details of a ritual to seal the path to the underworld. But only a pure-hearted, brave warrior could perform it. That man turned out to be your countryman, Jean, a mercenary named Bernard Partier, who was later named Yaotl by the Aztecs in their legends. Jean and the Irishman both shuddered at the same time. What? Yes, it was his skull we retrieved for Miss Mary, and I think by doing so we opened the passage to the land of the dead. I can't think of any other explanation for what's happening now. Recalling the black smoke that had swirled around the Russian when he took the skull, Jean swallowed hard. The mural we saw above the altar depicted Yaotl's last battle, Thornton continued. And that altar? The ritual was supposed to be performed on top of that same pyramid where the priests summoned Mictlantecutli, where the rift between worlds opened. Yaotl, or Bernard Partier, managed, despite the hordes of the dead, to climb to the top and perform the ritual. The pyramid collapsed and sank into the earth. That's it. The altar where we found the skull is the peak of the pyramid, buried under tons of soil. And the skull belongs to Yaotl himself. The young apprentice of a priest completed the ritual, enchanted Bernard's skull, and placed it on the altar, sealing the passage. That's how Bernard Partier, the French mercenary, became Yaotl, and then the guardian protecting the passage between worlds. Thornton coughed, spat out thick saliva, and smiled grimly. That's the situation, guys. Wait, are you serious right now? Jean looked at his companions in disbelief. A passage between worlds, the land of the dead, undead. What are you talking about? The legend says that anyone who desecrates Yaotl's skull will summon the demon again, and the dead will once more walk the earth, devouring the living or adding them to their army. Irishman? Jean turned to the man. And you believe this? How else do you explain all this? The Irishman jabbed the barrel of his shotgun toward Miss Mary's remains. Too many coincidences, too many coincidences. Damn. Jean couldn't believe what he was hearing. And what does adding them to their army mean? Anyone tainted by the dead becomes one of them, Thornton said wearily. Tainted? What do you mean, tainted? I saw a hotel porter torn apart by those things. His throat ripped open and a huge hole in his stomach, get up just a few seconds later and attack his colleague, the Irishman said in a quiet voice. And I saw a scratched girl who I barely saved from the horde lunge at me in the elevator trying to tear me apart. It's real. The Irishman sniffed, his eyes red. Jean looked at Thornton, who was desperately clutching his torn shoulder. The doctor met his gaze and said sadly, Yes, me too. Soon, very soon. The last words were a croak as Thornton slumped to the floor. Oh my God. Irishman. We have to do something. Jean turned to the man. I already know what to do. The Irishman's eyes were full of pain. Shoot them in the head, only in the head, or it's useless. At that moment, a rustling sound came from the corner. The men turned sharply toward Thornton. The doctor was crouched on all fours, arms slightly bent at the elbows, staring at them. A shiver ran down Jean's spine. Thornton's eyes were pitch black. Without breaking his gaze, the professor craned his neck, moving his head from side to side, the way professional boxers do when warming up. But with the doctor, it looked disturbing, animalistic. Thornton opened his mouth. No, it was more like a maw, and a trickle of saliva dripped onto the carpet. A guttural growl rose from his throat, and in that instant, Jean's ears were deafened for the third time that night. The Irishman's shotgun blast blew the professor's head clean off. The decapitated body slowly collapsed to the floor, convulsed a few times, then went still. That's how it's done, only in the head. Jean turned to look at the Irishman. The man was crying. What do we do now? Jean retrieved his pistol from under the bed, approached the door, and listened. The corridor was quiet, but the eerie screams from outside still drifted through the window. We're getting out of here, the Irishman said, his voice low but determined. But where? Jean, who was used to a relatively calm and orderly life, now looked completely lost. First, we're going to the doctor's room. For what? Jean stared at him in confusion. for his laptop with the manuscript translations. Then, to her room. The Irishman nodded toward the remains of their employer. "You want to sell the skull on your own?" Jean asked, catching on. "No, I want to try and stop this madness." For the first time, Jean heard a steely edge in the usually easygoing Irishman's voice. "I think Thornton's laptop has the description of the ritual that can end all of this." "But how do you plan to perform this ritual?" "Stop whining!" the Irishman snapped. "If some mercenary managed to pull it off hundreds of years ago, why can't we?" "Irishman, he died," Jean tried to reason with his friend. "Oops. I guess I didn't think about that." The Irishman shivered. "But hey, don't worry. You know what one of your countrymen said, someone who went down in history? The important thing is to get into the fight. We'll figure the rest out as we go." They reached the doctor's room without incident, encountering only a few mutilated corpses along the way. Jean felt nauseous more than once and swore to himself not to look too closely at the gruesome details anymore. While the Frenchman packed Thornton's laptop and papers into a backpack he'd found in the room, the Irishman stood guard, shotgun at the ready. Finally, Jean finished and gave the Irishman a questioning look. "What now?" "We head to Miss Mary's room." "Listen, man, are you sure we can handle this?" Jean's voice betrayed his growing doubts. "We can. You don't seriously think Thornton was reading the originals, do you? The guy was using translations, and even if we fail, at least we'll have tried. Either way, we're getting out of here." Getting the skull from Miss Mary's room wasn't a problem either. Breaking into the hotel safe took Jean only 5 minutes. After a brief discussion, they decided to make a run for the seaplane docked at the pier. Jean's experience with light aircraft didn't guarantee a smooth flight, but it was still a far better option than staying put. The Irishman methodically loaded his shotgun, stuffing spare shells into his pockets, while Jean checked his pistol and extra magazine again. They passed through several corridors without issue and emerged onto the staircase leading to the main hall. Then all hell broke loose. Jean barely remembered the path to the pier. His memory was a blur of twisted, snarling faces. Former hotel guests, their once respectable features now contorted with madness, their eyes pitch black. The deafening roar of the Irishman's shotgun echoed in his ears, and the image of a young waitress lying at Jean's feet, a bullet from his own gun lodged in her skull, burned into his mind. The long staircase to the beach was a brutal fight for every step down, filled with the guttural growls of the possessed and the screams of their victims. By the time they reached the plane, the road was littered with bodies, and Jean couldn't guarantee that all of them belonged to the crazed undead. But they made it. Standing on the wooden planks of the pier, they exchanged triumphant glances, but their celebration was cut short. Waiting in the shadow of the plane was Andre. Well, I'm glad you didn't disappoint me." The massive mercenary spoke with a mocking tone, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. He seemed completely unfazed by everything happening around him. "I expected something like this from you. I wouldn't be surprised if you somehow orchestrated this whole thing just to run off with our money." "My money." The last words came out as more of a growl than speech. "And what were you planning to do with this clown here? Dump him out of the plane?" Jean swallowed hard. A strange, irrational fear took hold of him. Not even fighting his way through a mob of snarling maniacs with black eyes had scared him this much. Maybe it was the memories of a scrawny schoolboy from a poor neighborhood defending himself from older bullies, hulking brutes in his mind just like Andre. fighting for a few meager coins his mother had earned through hard work at the laundromat, just enough for lunch. "Do you have the skull?" The Russian asked the question casually, as if he were asking for a light. That made Jean even more terrified. "Yes," Jean managed to say. "Hand it over." André stepped forward, stretching out his hand demandingly. And then, for what felt like the 100th time that long, terrible night, the Irishman's shotgun roared. The blast at close range practically blew André off the pier. There was only the loud splash as the heavy body crashed into the water. "Thick-headed brute," the Irishman muttered, staring into the dark water. It was later, as the plane's engines hummed steadily and they approached the shoreline, that Jean realized something was terribly wrong. He had been so focused on the controls, struggling to keep the massive machine on course, that it took him a moment to register what was happening. Maybe the Irishman had been scratched or bitten during the chaos and hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had been in denial, hoping they'd escape in time. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that in the seat next to Jean, there was no longer a man. An infernal creature thrashed wildly, something far from human. The crazed black eyes, the distorted face, and the seatbelt. The seatbelt Jean had insisted the Irishman wear before takeoff was now the only thing keeping the monstrous thing from tearing him apart. To say Jean was nervous would be an understatement. The plane dropped sharply in altitude. There was a sickening sound as the seatbelt began to tear from its moorings, and Jean panicked. Letting go of the controls, he fumbled desperately for his pistol. At that moment, Jean didn't care about flying. He only cared about surviving. The plane lurched again, roaring as it veered off course from the lagoon that was supposed to be their destination. The gun still wasn't within reach. Each terrifying second stretched into an eternity, and Jean felt himself slipping into unconsciousness from sheer terror. One final yank, and the deranged thing with black eyes broke free of its restraints. With a hungry snarl, it lunged at Jean, just as the plane slammed into the treetops. When he woke up, for the first few seconds, Jean couldn't believe he was still alive. A seatbelt pressed painfully against his chest, tightened during the crash when the seat had been torn from its mountings and spun around. Letting out a wheezing gasp, Jean tried to reach for the release. It took some effort, but he managed. After struggling for a bit, he realized he couldn't free himself. The latch was stuck. Something was painfully jabbing into his ribs. Feeling around, Jean's hand closed around the grip of his pistol. He let out a crooked smile. Why couldn't he have found it sooner? Then again, with his luck, it wasn't surprising. Grimacing from the pain, he was pretty sure a few of his ribs were broken, Jean tried to reach the control panel. Surprisingly, it wasn't as difficult as he expected. The seat had only rotated a bit, but hadn't completely come off the pedestal. He fumbled around until his hand found a compartment similar to a glove box in a car. Opening it, he reached inside. A cup, a rag, something unidentifiable. There it was. His hand closed around a sturdy handle. Pulling it out, he saw he was holding a good-quality multi-tool. Perfect. Pulling out the wide blade, he began sawing through the seatbelt. The thick fabric, reinforced with plastic, resisted at first, but after a while, he managed to cut himself free. He stood up, as much as the low cabin ceiling allowed, and looked around. In a strange way, the crash had saved him. The Irishman's head had been smashed into some kind of ledge, his skull crushed when the impact flung him backward with monstrous force. Jean gave a bitter smile. The Irishman had been a good companion. May he rest in peace. Groaning and wincing from the pain, Jean climbed out of the cockpit, grabbing the backpack with the laptop and the skull on his way out. The plane had sheared off the tops of the trees and plowed into the jungle, leaving a massive trail of destruction. Jean sniffed the air. For once today he was lucky. There was no smell of burning. Maybe, in his panic, he'd instinctively cut the engines before the beast that had been the Irishman attacked. Thank you, flight instructor. After moving away from the plane, Jean rummaged through the pockets of his loose hiking pants and pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He lit one with his lighter, took a deep drag, and collapsed heavily onto the ground. Opening the flap of the backpack, Jean peeked inside. The laptop was shattered, but the cursed skull of his countryman was intact, as if it hadn't been through a plane crash at all. Damn it, Jean muttered. How am I supposed to perform the ritual now? You won't have to. Jean jumped to his feet, simultaneously pulling out his pistol. Who's there? One of the shadows detached itself from the trees and moved toward him. The moonlight filtered through the branches, and Jean saw the same beggar standing before him. I will perform the ritual. Jean took another deep drag from his cigarette, then flicked it away. It hissed as it hit the shoreline. The events of the past night flickered through his mind in disjointed flashes, tormenting his already frayed nerves. As far as Jean understood, the old man was the apprentice of the priest who had helped his fellow countrymen perform the ritual and had enchanted his skull, turning it into a lock for the door to the world of the dead, almost 500 years ago. For someone from the 21st century, it sounded insane, but no more insane than the creatures with black eyes who had turned the hotel into a slaughterhouse last night. They reached the cave quickly. Jean's luck hadn't entirely run out, and the plane had crashed not too far from the cliffs where the entrance was hidden among the rocks. The old man didn't speak much, and told Jean right away that everything he could have done had already been done. From here on, the old man would handle the rest, but Jean followed him, partly out of stubbornness, and partly because a small part of him still suspected the old man might be a cunning con artist, planning to escape with a relic worth millions of dollars. However, the further they went, the more convinced Jean became that this wasn't the case. The howling wind that kicked up the moment the old man, holding Yaotl's skull in his outstretched hands, entered the cave convinced Jean once and for all that this was real, that the man who looked like a homeless beggar was, in fact, a 500-year-old priest. The wind roared, bending the treetops. A haunting chant echoed from the cave in a language Jean didn't understand, and the Frenchman, a specialist in breaking into safes, wanted in his homeland, and half-heartedly pursued by Interpol, sat on a clearing in the Yucatan jungle, lighting one cigarette after another and sipping scorching absinthe from his flask. At some point, the storm seemed to reach its peak. The old priest's voice wavered on a high note, then suddenly fell silent, and a brilliant green flash lit up the surroundings, followed by a deafening crash. Jean jumped to his feet, dropping the flask, and tried to blink away the strange light that had blinded him. When his vision cleared, the first thing he did was turn toward the cave. The cave was gone. In its place stood a massive boulder, which must have rolled down from one of the surrounding hills. The wind had stopped as if by magic. Jean stood there for a while longer, staring at the sealed cave, entombing the buried pyramid within the earth, and then began trudging back to the plane. When he reached the crash site, he struggled to access the cargo hold, and after a brief search, pulled out 2 bundles. Inside them was a 3-person Zodiac boat, which they had used to travel from the plane to the shore earlier, along with a small engine. Jean held a canister of fuel in his hands. If he was lucky, He'd managed to drag everything to the shore, and the fuel would be enough to get him back to the hotel. Only then would he know if the old man's attempt had succeeded. Flicking a pebble at a crab scuttling toward the body of a portly man with a bloody stomach, Gene slowly got to his feet. It was time to get out of here unless he wanted to spend a long, very long time explaining himself to the Belize police. One thing was for sure, he wasn't signing up for any more archaeological expeditions, not for any amount of money.